It's Le Mans weekend, and if you haven't seen Kevin Estra's pole lap that he did last night, I highly recommend you do so. The LMP1s were on rails compared to the hypercars. It's an absolutely brilliant lap. He's actually riding the rear brakes into the first braking zone. Just unbelievable. It's on my Twitter, and it's also on my community tab if you just want a fast way of finding it. And because it's Le Mans weekend, I thought I'd do a themed video for you all, because that's what I like to do for these bigger races. Because, I mean, most of you are here for the Formula 1 related stuff, and that's by far the most popular motorsport out there. We do have to pay attention to the rest of the motorsports too. I do love Le Mans, and I love the history. I love the cars, I love the vibes, I love everything about it. It's part of the Motorsport Triple Crown after all. And like other forms of motorsport, Le Mans is no stranger to drama. The biggest drama in recent memory being the Toyota in 2016 breaking down with just minutes remaining on the clock. Basically, the start of the final lap. 8 miles from victory, and Porsche snagged it right at the end. You drive for 24 hours, or nearly 24 hours, the car has zero issues, you're leading with enough of a cushion that you can just back off and ease home, and then that happens. Hello darkness my old friend, and all that. Then there's the cars and the drivers, the stars of the show if you will. The recently departed LMP1 cars, the current hypercars that are just utterly brilliant and have captured the right balance of show, regulations and manufacturer participation. There's the GT1s, the Group C monsters, all the way back to the sports cars of the 1960s that GP Laps and others probably consider to still be modern. The drivers of Derek Bell, Jackie Ickx, Tom Christensen, Henri Pescarolo, Graham Hill and Andre Lotterer, to name quite literally some. And the cars they drove: Audi, Porsche, Ferrari, Bugatti, Bentley, Jaguar and yes, Mazda. And there's also the one we're going to look at today, Ford, specifically that Ford, the GT40. Now, I accept that this one has been done before, way back in 2018, just before the film Ford vs Ferrari was announced, which was good timing, come to think of it. But that was back when production values were totally awful. Okay, admittedly they're not much better now, but there was also rock music that was occasionally far too loud, and then 2 years later I had to take down over 2 years worth of videos because of the images that were used within them, which was a bit of a pain in the arse at the time, but it is what it is. Had nothing to do with the FIA, Formula 1 or any of that stuff either, by the way. But I guess it was a blessing. It means I got to remake them all in this newer, modern and better style for everybody, and give you a remastered product that might teach you more than the original video did, because I now know what I'm doing. In my mind. I do try to keep the remakes to a minimum. I try to spread them out over the course of however long, and I don't tend to do loads in one go, but I have got a lot of stuff on this week, so if you do see some remakes or remasters as we'll call them, then that'll be why. But still, it's the Ford GT40, one of my favourite cars of all time. It might be my favourite racing car of all time, certainly, so, well, any excuse to talk about it. So then, we're going all the way back to the 1960s with this one, a time of massive change for the world. We escaped nuclear annihilation in 1963 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The space race was in full swing with Yuri Gagarin being the first man in space in 1961, followed by Alan Shepard and John Glenn. And on top of this, probes were being sent out to the farthest reaches of the solar system. Mariner 2 flew past Venus. Venera 4 managed to enter Venus's atmosphere and take readings. And this paved the way for Venera 9 and 10 to land on Venus in the 70s and take pictures. Before melting, obviously. There was also the advances in military technology. The Vietnam War helped usher in the era of fire and forget missiles. The jet age had well and truly begun, with Boeing taking what de Havilland had done with the Comet and making it better in the 707, 727 and 737 lines, before ending the decade with the 747, while the British and the French collaborated to make the world even smaller by building Concorde. Oh, and the SR-71 was in development too. Utterly incredible machines, all created by countries flopping the proverbial out on the table and measuring it to extract every last millimetre. And on a less comical note, there was the nuclear arms race. There were a lot of nukes being tested and developed, and it was just a very, very scary time. If you're not clued up on all of this, or you've just forgotten GCSE history, I urge you to go and Google the Tsar Bomber. TSAR space Bomber. And just be glad that nothing like that was ever used on people. But anyway, the battle for supremacy reigned on the track too, especially at Le Mans. Formula 1 cars had gone backwards slightly in this time, with the FIA saying that all cars now had to be 1.5 litre machines that were just incredibly slow and sluggish compared to what they'd become in the latter part of the decade. And actually, that's something to look at when the Formula 1 World Championship wasn't run to Formula 1 rules, but to Formula 2 rules. That'll be interesting, so maybe it's not all going to be remakes after all. But in sports cars, the rules had remained somewhat stable, but it meant that sports cars were now becoming faster than the FIA's Crown Jewel series. And running the show on the sports car front was Ferrari, especially at Le Mans when they won in 1960 with the 250 Testarossa. They'd repeat that feat in 1961, 1962 and 1963, but around the springtime of 1963 they were being courted by Ford. The Ford Motor Company had been in a spot of bother prior to this. During the war period, sales had stagnated, profits were all over the place, and they'd slipped down behind GM and Chrysler in terms of sales. The Ford family was up there with the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts as being the cornerstone of American capitalism, and after returning from his service in the US Navy in 1943, Henry Ford II managed to do enough to convince his grandfather to let him take over the family business. The business that had fallen into disarray because Harry Bennett had taken on more and more of a hands-on role as Henry Ford got older and weaker. Eventually, Ford Jr. got the job. He took over the company in 1945, sacked Bennett, and then started to rescue a company that was basically, well, buggered. Ford's European factories had been reduced to rubble. Sales had plummeted in the war period with, well, the war, and he had to rescue the damage done. On top of this, enthusiasm wasn't exactly high for the new boss given he'd been kicked out of Yale University because he'd paid another student to write his papers for him, and he had very little business experience. It was one of these, yes, I know he's the boss's grandson because it's a family business, but this guy knows absolutely nothing type of deal. Ford Jr. managed to salvage the company from tumbling towards bankruptcy, but the failed launch of the Edsel in the late 1950s knocked the company back a bit, and the original expansion from the brink slowed once again. In the 1950s, people had more money and could now afford to buy more than just a mass-produced car for the people. They were going to Chevy, they were going to Chrysler, they were going to other American brands that were offering more choice. Ford needed another plan. They needed a sports car. The problem was they didn't have the know-how with which to build one of these European-style sports cars. They also didn't really have the money to do the development and the research into developing a European-style sports car. So they figured, why don't we save some of the money and sort of cut out part of the process by just buying a company that specialises in European sports cars? One that's just won Le Mans 3 times on the trot, like Ferrari. By the spring of 1963, a deal was almost in place. Enzo Ferrari himself even liked the deal, and he was very close to saying yes to this deal, until Ford suggested that in the deal that they were proposing, they took everything. They didn't just own the name and the brand, but everything else within, including the racing teams. This made Enzo flip like a switch, and he withdrew from the deal, hurling obscenities and personal jabs at Ford and his family on the way out, rumoured to be something along the lines of, you aren't even half the man your grandfather was, your cars are shit, your factory's shit, and your company's shit, leaving Ford to return to Detroit with his face red from embarrassment. Ironically, the same colour as a Ferrari. To make matters worse, it's also implied or rumoured, whichever way you want to look at it, that Ferrari was just stringing Ford along in order to extract more money from Fiat, so he could have more money, and Fiat was actually going to let him keep the racing teams and take over the rest, and that would actually go through in 1969. So when they got back to Detroit, they held a meeting in the big snazzy boardroom in Detroit, and Ford basically said, I don't care how much money it costs, we are going to destroy this man and everything he loves at Le Mans. They then made some phone calls to a few Lansing sheds in the UK with a simple brief. We'll build the engine, you build the car. Which seems like a very good way of building the ultimate racing machine, really. Get the Yanks to build the engine and get the Brits to build the actual car. And afterwards maybe call in the Germans to make sure it all works. Ford would build the engine in Detroit, but the task of designing the car would be left to somebody in the UK. Ford spoke to Lotus, Cooper and Lola for design of the vehicle, and Cooper said no because they had no sports car experience and the company was borderline doomed. Lotus wanted their name on the car since they were doing most of the legwork, plus Chapman had already got his Formula 1 and Indy projects on, so that left Lola, who were actually very good at building sports cars. The first prototypes of what would become the GT40, so called because it was 40 inches tall, were modified versions of the Lola Mark VI, and if you look at very early versions of the GT40, you'll notice the similarities. The problem was, Lola had built themselves a car that was incredibly fast, but had a few problems that were beyond suboptimal, but downright dangerous. When you hit the brakes at high speeds, such as braking for Mulsanne Corner because there were no chicanes on the Mulsanne Straight back then, sorry, Le Hundier, or however it's pronounced, basically the brakes got incredibly hot, about 820 degrees Celsius, which is, well, it's rookie numbers today because there's carbon ceramic brakes, there's exotic materials all over the place, but back then, you were basically on a one-way trip to the morgue, let alone a hospital. Lola went for the minimal effort way of doing things. Lola sold Ford a couple of Mark VI chassis that Ford could then develop into its own car, which explains the similarities in the early stages. After which, Harley Kopp, who worked for Ford, Eric Broadley of Lola, along with Aston Martin's John Wyer and Ford's Roy Lunn, moved the whole operation to Slough, to the west of London, where they set up the Ford Advanced Vehicles division and got to work, trying to iron out the stuff that was basically going to shorten the life expectancy of anybody that drove it. The car was a failure once it got to racing. At the 1964 1,000 kilometres of Nürburgring, the suspension went. Then at Le Mans, all 3 entries retired while the red Ferrari went on to win. Again. Things didn't improve and the irate Ford called in someone in California to take over things instead. Carroll Shelby. Oh, and Holman Moody, who did the bodywork. Shelby had a personal beef with Enzo. When Shelby was racing in Europe in the early 1960s, a close friend of his, along with others, had been killed while driving Ferrari's cars, and Shelby was less than impressed when Enzo saw his drivers as being, well, basically disposable. So when he was asked if he wanted to be part of a Ferrari-killing car, Shelby said yes. When he received the cars from England, he looked at them and went, "What the hell is this?" Shelby's input on the cars got them in shape enough to take second at the 1965 Daytona 1000 kilometres. The engine had gone up from a 4.7 litre to a 7 litre V8 engine, which was also the same engine used in the NASCAR cars, and most of the kinks were ironed out. The following year, 1966, the first ever Daytona 24 was held, and the new Mark II finished 1-2-3, with Ken Miles being one of the drivers in the winning car. At the 12 Hours of Sebring, it was 1-2-3 again. Miles in the winning car once more. Miles was also integral to the development of the GT40. The Brummie from Sutton Coldfield they named Sidebite because he talked out the side of his mouth was working as a mechanic at an MG dealer in California and was racing his own vehicles in SCCA races, and typically won. This attracted the attention of Shelby, and Miles in turn became Shelby's chief test driver. Between 1964 and 1966, they did whatever they could to improve the car with the limited tech of the time. One thing they did for aerodynamics was they taped little strips of wool to various points on the car. If the wool went flat against the bodywork, they knew that the aero was working properly. If it flapped around, they knew they had to change something. Which is pretty good, considering what they had at their disposal in terms of technology. But one thing was clear, this car was fast. It was doing about 210 miles an hour in a straight line down the Mulsanne Straight. So, round came the 1966 24 Hours of Le Mans, and Ford went scorched earth with the entries. 12 GT40s were entered across several teams, with Shelby American having 2 cars. Not all of these were Mark IIs, it has to be said. Some of them were Mark Is, which, as you might imagine, didn't make the end. And Ford had signed so many top drivers to drive these cars too. Miles, Bruce McLaren, Denny Hulme, Lucien Bianchi, yes, it's a relation, Graham Hill, Dan Gurney, who had to have a piece of extra headroom called the Gurney bubble installed to cope with his 6'4" frame, Peter Revson, Guy Ligier, Richie Ginther, Pedro Rodriguez, Mark Donoghue, Mario Andretti, and Bob Bondurant. And that's not all the drivers either. Now this is more about the car than the race. I have done a, look, you can cry all you want but Miles didn't win Le Mans type of video a long time ago, but the race wasn't smooth sailing. Several cars dropped out with problems, and Miles did have a problem with his door in the opening phase and had to somehow get it shut. But he rocketed off into the lead. If he won, he'd have been the first driver to win the Triple Crown of endurance racing, and would have done it in the same year too. And this is when Ford's Leo Beebe stepped in. With the Fords running 1-2-3, it made sense to conjure up a photo op. With the Ferraris all out and the next brand, a Porsche, being 22 laps down, it made sense for the Ford company to say, "We won Le Mans, we destroyed Ferrari, aren't we great?" So they ordered Miles to slow down and allow the other car of Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon to catch up. There's also the Go Like Hell story, which is when Chris Amon and Bruce McLaren were basically saying, we're going to catch up to Ken Miles and we're going to try and win this thing, which Ford didn't look too favourably on. But either way, they were still running, they were 1-2, and they managed to get back onto the same lap because Miles' car had encountered brake problems. So at the end of it all, they were there ready to set up this photo finish, with the two cars in the lead on the same lap. Now in the film, BB is presented as your typical slimy corporate bozo with the ego the size of a small moon, and serves as kind of the antagonist for the film. They took artistic license and things like that, as they often do in these biopics. He's presented as somebody who didn't like Ken Miles that much because in one scene in the film, Miles stands there and rips into the Ford Mustang before labelling everything that needs changing, and the scene ends with something like, and even if you did all that, I'd still buy a Chevy Chevelle, and that's a fucking terrible car. So now there's this thing where BB was out to screw Miles, but the truth is, everybody that met Leo said that he was a lovely human being. Miles slowed down and Ford got its photo op, but then the results came in. Due to the rules at Le Mans at the time, in the event of a dead heat, the car that travelled furthest over the 24 hours was declared the winner. Because McLaren and Amon had travelled something like 60 feet further because they started further back on the grid, they were declared the winners, and Miles missed out on the Triple Crown. But Miles was somewhat gracious in defeat, even though he was incredibly miffed, saying something along the lines of, well, I didn't win, but what can you do? He was more grateful for the fact that he got to drive this car than getting the win, which is conveyed to Shelby in the film. But sadly, Miles never got another go at winning Le Mans. Just 2 months after the race, he was killed testing Ford's latest upgrade called the J car. The car was made out of aluminium honeycomb panels, which were usable, but they hadn't been tested in this particular way before. Basically, what had happened was the car was generating so much rear lift that the thing basically just lost control and crashed. And because there was no roll cage in the car, Miles was killed. And it was the J car, the Mark IV as it became, as the Mark III was a road car only, that was used for 1967. Looks very similar to the Lola, doesn't it? And Ford basically shut out all of its UK partners to make sure that this thing was an in-house product, as well as making sure the car had a roll cage to protect drivers if it went over, as Walt Hangson was killed in basically a carbon copy crash in the same car. Ferrari was crushed 2 years in a row, but at least a Ferrari finished this time, with AJ Foyt and Dan Gurney driving a GT40 to victory 4 laps of the 330 P4, with another 330 getting in between the next Ford of McLaren and Donoghue, who finished 4th. But the pace of the Ford was insane. It clocked 212 miles an hour on the Mulsanne. The Mark V, with its improvements, went from looking like the original Lola that kicked off the program to looking like the Mark I, and this was the car that would be used through 1968 and 1969, where once again the car would take victory at Le Mans. Lucien Bianchi and Pedro Rodriguez won in 1968, with Lucien's brother actually dying during the race, and then in 1969, victory was basically a literal last to first challenge. Jackie Ickx was protesting the traditional Le Mans start by walking to his car while everybody else was running, and he took the time to do up his seatbelts while he knew that nobody else would be doing so. By the end of that first lap, a driver had been killed, and the accident almost took Chris Amon with it. And Ickx, along with Jackie Oliver, the Arrows founder, came through the field to win the 4th Le Mans in a row for the GT40, and also the last top-class win for Ford that it would have. The GT40s were no longer Shelby American cars but John Wyer cars. Wyer took over the Ford Advanced Vehicles operation after 1966 and was building production GT40s for Ford, this being in part because the rules were changing. The top category was being shrunk to 3 litres, with up to 5 litres still allowed if at least 50 road-going examples were built, which Ford had done, so they were allowed to keep the 5-litre cars in 1968. But by 1969, the car was basically obsolete and Wyer was starting to work on Porsches. The reason that the Mark V looks so similar to the Mark I is because Wyer was taking Mark I GT40s and then upgrading them, essentially. The GT40, like mentioned at the top of the video, is one of, if not my favourite racing car of all time. I like it because of, well, the shape, the colours that were basically the colours available on the Mustang until Wyer got involved, where it became the Gulf colours, and the fact that the reason behind it was because of personal beef. The car exists for a petty reason, but at the same time it brought Ford forward from a company that sold cars for the common man to cars that had a sporting pedigree. The Mustang is synonymous with muscle cars, along with the Dodge Charger and the Chevrolet Camaro, and is racing in GT3 competition as I speak. While it was born out of a petty grudge, it's now become an iconic car for reasons that are everything but a petty grudge. And I'm a massive Ford fan anyway. The Mondeo BTCC car, the Focus RS, the Sierra Cosworth, I love the lot of them. And I think the reason I am a Ford fan is because of the GT40. So then, a revisit to the legendary, beautiful, fast as hell, and just all-round awesome Ford GT40. If this has been an educational look through the motorsport history books, then do like the video so I know I did a good job. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help me out at a more personal level, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and other bits and pieces that you might want or need to know. Also, let me know down in the comments who your pick is for Le Mans. I kind of want Porsche to win, but Cadillac looks pretty good at the minute. There's also super thanks if you want to buy me a coffee, and also memberships if you just want a Patreon alternative. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.